Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back. We're back with more Live from the Heartland for the week of April 29th. I'm Michael James here in Chicago. And as usual, whenever I have this young fellow on the show, it's a great pleasure to bring on the one and only Mike Klonsky, host of Hitting Left with the Klonsky Brothers. Does a lot of other stuff. How are you today, Mike?
I'm great, Michael. Thank you.
Have you been in the cold yet today in Florida?
Well, you know, we're not really on vacation down here. We're down here taking care of my wife Susan's father, who's 99, and who he fell and broke his hip, which for a lot of people that's a death warrant, you know.
That's the end.
But yeah, so we're trying to get him up walking again, and he is. He's making great progress. So we're very happy about that.
Well, as an old guy myself, not quite that old, I'm really glad to hear that there is potential for recovery.
Right.
Things come down.
You yourself have been through it a couple of times.
A couple of times. You know, Mike, as you know, I teach at DePaul and a class on activism. And one of the things that we do in that class is we bring in people who are involved in the struggle in various ways, many people that you know, and they kind of will tell us what they did, but also kind of talk about their life, where they came from, how they got involved, and what they've done. And I'm trying to build that theme into the show here too, that bringing on progressive folks that I know, and I know the great work they've done, and just to have them talk a little bit about how they got into being in the movement, an organizer, an activist, and a few of the things they've done. And then we're going to whip right on to world affairs, local stuff, Florida Report, et cetera, et cetera. So fill us in on yourself, brother. A little
I'm getting old. I don't know if I can hold up under all that questioning, but I'll try. I am a longtime activist. I consider myself a radical activist, and my activities go back really to the 60s, mid 60s, really. And I've been involved in struggles around, against war, for social justice. I've been a union organizer. I've been a community organizer. I've traveled around the world looking at world revolutions and trying to be a witness of them and document them and look at their, meeting with revolutionary leaders. And anyway, I've done, like you, Michael, I've done a lot of stuff. One thing that I've been involved in all that time, as you have, has been trying to develop alternative media, whether it be like the way we did it back in the day, where we had underground newspapers. I remember the first time I met you, you were talking a paper called The Movement.
Yeah, that was in LA. We were on, Terry Cannon was the editor. Joe Blum was the associate editor. I was a Chicago correspondent, and we took a tour, which I won't go into the details, but you were one of the first stops, on the West Coast. We had made it all the way over to Mississippi, Louisiana, up to Chicago. But
well, at that time, myself and a group that later became the SDS chapter, Students for Democratic Society chapter in Southern California, we were doing draft resistance work out of a draft resistance office in LA. And that's where I remember you stopping by, and we were counseling young people on how to avoid the draft. We were running people up to Canada, doing disrupting draft boards, doing all kind of crazy stuff. And then in 1967, I traveled to Michigan and went to my first SDS convention. And it's a funny thing, as we were leaving the convention, a young woman asked if she could hitch a ride with us. We drove from LA to Chicago and back. I mean, from LA to Michigan and back. And she said, can I hitch a ride with you back to LA? She says, the National Office of SDS is sending a group of us out there to help you get organized and to become part of the SDS national scene. And it turned out to be a woman I would later marry, Susan Ennett.
Oh, I didn't know that story.
Yeah. And so, she was very sick at that time. She had the flu or something like that. So the three of me and Paul, the late Paul and Joby Shinoff, who drove together, we stuck her in the back seat, and the three of us rode together in the front seat all the way to LA because we didn't want to be near her because she was coughing and sneezing. And anyway, to make a long story short, we got to LA, and the next thing I know, she had moved in to my place. And now next week, or actually May 12th, 55 years later, we celebrate our anniversary.
And you're down there together helping with her dad.
We're down here together helping with her dad. And when you say, how did you get involved in the movement? Well, the way I got involved in SDS was by Susan. She recruited us. She was actually helping to raise money for us for our draft resistance project. It's something called Vietnam Summer. She was one of the coordinators of it. And so I had talked to her on the phone several times, but never met her. And then I finally met her at the convention, and she came out to LA, and a whole group of them came out. Carl Davidson, a bunch of people from the what we call the NO, then the National Office.
National Office.
Yeah, and then the next year, I went back to the SDS convention in '68, and got elected to become the national secretary of SDS. And then Susan and I packed up everything we had, moved back to Chicago, moved into an apartment in the West Side, which was burning down at the time after Dr. King was assassinated. And there's a lot to this story that we don't have time to get into.
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of stuff. I'm glad you came back to Chicago. You were you were the national secretary of SDS. I was on the National Interim Committee. I think 3 times I was elected to that. And the other thing was that I'm just going to mention, you and I went on a trip with Athletes United for Peace to the Soviet Union. And we played baseball in Donetsk, in Leningrad. We went to Sochi. We had a good time. We'll save that for another time.
We went to Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, it wasn't a separate country then, but let's move to Ukraine. That's what got me going and getting a hold of you about coming on. What's your take on the Ukraine? I heard a very interesting report yesterday on NPR. Lula, the newly reelected after some time out of office, president of Brazil.
Went to China, you're talking about.
Went to China, but they also talked about negotiations and how to handle Ukraine. Why don't you talk about Ukraine and NATO, et cetera? What's at stake? What's going on? Because a lot of us are all for Ukraine, but it's a complicated story.
Very good point, Michael. It's a complicated story, and it's not just a matter of cheerleading one side or the other. The origins of this go way back before the Russian invasion in February of last year. There was actually a U.S.-backed coup d'état which overthrew the president of Ukraine in 2014, and there's been fighting going on, especially in the Donbass region and in the southeast of Ukraine ever since, as there's a separatist movement of Russian-speaking people in that part of the country who want to affiliate or want to be part of the Soviet Union, of Russia, the former Soviet Union. Russia has dreams of reconstituting the former Soviet Union, which when we went to Russia to play baseball, the Soviet Union was collapsing. It was in the process of falling apart, and it ultimately did. And so the countries that were part of what some people call the prison house of nations within the USSR declared their independence and tried to move out of the Soviet orbit. anyway, I don't want to get too far into that, but finally, last year, the Russians, who were worried about NATO advances in Europe, including recruiting Ukraine into NATO, as well as Finland, another country that borders on Russia, they launched what they would, well, anyway, it was kind of a preemptive invasion, horrible invasion, which led to tremendous devastation, loss of life, uprooted millions of Ukrainians from their home, scattered them all over the world. And then the U.S. saw an opportunity to move in and start arming the Ukrainian army. And the struggle, in my view, moved from strictly an independence movement to free Ukraine from Russian domination into a proxy war between the two big powers, U.S. and Russia. And we've seen that happen all over the globe. We've seen battles between imperialist rivals. Well, that's how really the First World War and the Second World War began. And this could possibly be the way the Third World War begins. And this World War, if it's allowed to spread beyond the borders of Ukraine, could easily turn into a world war and a nuclear conflagration, which could devastate the whole globe.
Yeah, one of the things that I heard was Finland was accepted for NATO membership, I believe, and
yes.
Ukraine is still trying to be accepted. But one of the things that the Russians are concerned about is you would have NATO right up against, like on a 1,500-mile border against the Soviet Union, against Russia. Keep calling it the wrong thing. And
be like Canada.
It'd
be like Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean joining the Russian Federation or the Russian military alliance. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things going on, though, is just an awareness now that the United States, along a superpower, but only like about 4% of the world's population, I think. You know, I used to talk about someday the United States will be viewed in the world community as a country that worked for the good of the whole. Now, that would be great. Right now, there's a lot of other countries who feel they don't have a say. That would include South Africa, Brazil, India. You know, they don't have permanent seats on the UN the way the United States, Russia, and China do, and France and England. So while some people are calling for what I think they call a multipolarity world, where a lot of people get to share in the being dominant, versus a U.S.-controlled dominance of the world. Any take on any of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm one of those people. I've always been against imperialism, especially the imperialism of our own country. It's thirst to expand and dominate other countries, which have led to one war after another. And rather than have a policy of cooperation with other countries, rather than have especially in times of crisis, like the COVID pandemic, this was an opportunity where the European powers, China, the U.S., Russia, everybody should have been cooperating, trying to fight a common foe, which was the pandemic. And instead, you had this vaccine imperialism and the unnecessary deaths of millions of people. And we have to understand that imperialism is a system. It's a global system of competition, based on competition and rivalry. It starts out with economic expansion and economic rivalry, but it inevitably leads to war if it's not constrained or not controlled. So right now, you have this unwinnable proxy war going on in Ukraine, which is affecting the global economy. Terrible inflation around the world. The prices of food and energy are out of reach for many people. And many countries, regardless of their political system or whatever, are demanding an end to the war and demanding um, immediate negotiations between the conflicting powers, and not just countries, but international figures like the Pope, like the UN, the head of the UN, Mr. Gutierrez. They're all saying we need to stop the fighting now. You have to understand that while the U.S. is supplying weapons to Ukraine, all the missiles that are being fired, all the bombs that are exploding, are all falling on Ukrainian. They're all killing Ukrainians and Russian workers who've been drafted or conscripted into the war. And so this is not this is a war similar to World War I, a terrible imperialist war now. And it calls for everybody to put pressure on our own government here and demand an end to that war and an end to U.S. kind of stoking the fires of war by just pouring tons of missiles and billions of dollars in military support, and to push for a negotiated settlement.
Oh, that would be great. I'm remembering the Vietnam War, where most of the people in the country were for the war. By the end of the war, most of the people were against it. And then the next thing, when we had all this stuff going on in Iran, everyone was for war again. It's like the populace of the United States goes back and forth. But I think in this case, a lot of people don't have the scoop, the real information on this. I mean, I don't want to come off like I'm rooting for Russia, because I definitely am for the people of Ukraine, but it is a little bit complicated. People need to know more.
That's complicated, but our demand is simple. We're against war and we're for peace.
Right.
And you can't have peace without justice. And so we're for justice. And how justice can be worked out in that situation should be a product of the negotiations. And right now, countries like China have a proposal for peace. And in fact, President Zelensky of Ukraine has shown an interest in that proposal. And they recently, President Xi of China and Zelensky of Ukraine have had a meeting via phone the other day. And Zelensky sounded very favorable. He said, in fact, in his words, he said that the call with Xi served as a powerful impetus to their bilateral relationship. And he said, I had a long and meaningful phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And I believe that this call, as well as the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China, will give powerful impetus to the development of bilateral relations. And especially, he saw that it could help in terms of ending the war. So that's encouraging. That's a big shift. And I'm sure it has Biden and Secretary Blinken and other cold warriors here in the United States worried to death that China is going to get the credit for a negotiated peace in Ukraine.
Well, yeah, and as we said at the outset, Lula went and met with Xi, and the U.S. then upped the amount of money that we just gave to Brazil for the rainforest. So there's a lot of stuff going on. People working, trying to work.
The U.S. is putting tremendous pressure on Lula.
They are.
The newly elected president of Brazil, a revolutionary leader in Brazil, who helped topple the fascist regime that ran the country before. The countries of what we used to call the third world or the non-aligned movement are all basically coming out and following Lula's lead and calling for a peaceful settlement, because their countries are bearing the brunt of a lot of this, the fighting. The fighting has disrupted, for example, the flow of wheat and energy from that part of the world. Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, really. And when those shipments stopped because of the war, it led to starvation in many countries in Africa. So this war is already kind of has global implications. And it's not just,
I was saying the Ukraine farmers aren't getting money for their grain. They're sitting on last year's crops. So anyhow, let's switch. We only got a couple minutes left, but you're in Florida, and one of the most negative politicians out there is the governor of Florida, and he's in a battle going on with Disney. Oh, it's a little complicated, but Disney is suing the governor of Florida. Give us a quick Florida report.
We came down to Florida. My wife and I came down to Florida, as I said, to try to deal with some family health issues. We had to postpone our flight 3 times because of the weather in Fort Lauderdale. They called it the flood of the century, or 1,000-year flood even. And I don't know if you saw the videos. There were people swimming down Broward Boulevard, and the runways at Fort Lauderdale Airport were underwater, under 2 feet of water. Finally, they opened up one, and on Friday we were able to fly in. And so here's now they've pretty much cleaned up the mess. But one story that won't go away is that DeSantis, or as we call him, DeFascist.
That's good.
He fled Florida
to Iowa
in the wake of the storm, and went on a presidential campaign tour and book tour in Iowa and Ohio, and then hopped on a flight to Tokyo, and he's on a world tour now, visiting Tokyo and South Korea and Israel, and campaigning like crazy. But he's abandoned the thousands of people here in this part of Florida who lost everything in the floods. And so people are really pissed at Governor DeSantis, who looked like he was going to be the main rival of Trump in the presidential primary, the Republican presidential primary. For a while, he was looking like a sane, rational, right-wing alternative to Trump. But now his numbers are in the toilet, largely because of this situation. And Trump is rubbing his hands together with glee, attacking DeSantis. And so are the Democrats. And the Democrats, are jumping for joy over this turn of events.
They need to jump for joy, because they haven't done very well down there for a while.
Oh, well, no kidding. And the thing is that I was just reading, only 6% of voters in the United States want to see an election in 24 between Biden and Trump. That's not who people want to see running against each other in 2 years. But despite that, it looks very much like they will be the candidates. So that's a statement on democracy, American democracy, really, to me. The people, the great majority of people don't want Biden or Trump running. And yet Biden announced yesterday that he's going to be the candidate. And it doesn't look like there's even going to be a primary, it means anything. In fact, Bernie Sanders announced today that he's not running.
He's supporting Biden.
Yeah, he's supporting Biden. So the thing that troubles me the most, Michael, as a progressive, as a leftist, is that it looks like the left presence within the Democratic Party, which was kind of strong 4 years ago, with the squad and with Bernie running as a strong opposition candidate, we were able to get things in the platform and win certain gains. It now looks like that faction has collapsed. And I really worry about that. The left needs to have an independent voice, an independent presence in American politics. And if we can't have our own party, we should be able to have a strong presence within the Democratic Party. And that's why I started out talking about independent media. That's an important part of it. And that's why it's so important that what you're doing with Live from the Heartland and what I'm trying to do with Hitting Left and with my writings on Substack and other places, and what other people are doing as well, I mean, in their podcasts and TV and radio programs, is to establish a strong independent base in which political organizing can take place around us. It can provide a scaffold or a structure for that to go on. And right now, I'm worried about that kind of being crushed. And so when you were asking what are progressives to do right now, I think that should be a clue. We need to develop our strong, united, independent presence. And here in Chicago, that's going to be a tough road to hoe because of all the infighting that's taken place during the last two mayoral elections. But that's getting into a whole other topic.
Yeah, so we're going to have you back, like I said before we even started, that rather than go too long, we're going to, because I do have another guest coming on, we're going to have you regularly, which we already do. So, Mike, you have a great time down in Florida. I give my best to your father-in-law, to your wife, anyone else I know down there. And
thank you, Michael.
Will people can tune you in on Fridays at
11 to noon, WLPN 105.5 FM on your radio dial in Chicago and streaming live on lumpinradio.com.
All right, Klonsky, you're a hell of a guy. I always like talking to you. One thing we didn't talk about was Kim Foxx.
Your listeners can follow me at substack.com, and I'll be writing about the Kim Foxx situation there.
Well, send me a copy, brother, and we'll see.
Okay, brother. Take care.